I'm Shannon Sheridan, and I'm a research librarian at PNNL. I'm helping the MSD-LIVE team create how-to guides so that users can maximize the utility of MSD-LIVE. This video will briefly explain some best practices to consider when creating file naming conventions and organizing a folder hierarchy. Let's start with file naming schemas. A file naming schema, or convention, is a framework for naming your files in a way that describes what they contain and how they relate to other files. The following questions we're going to walk through will help you consider what information you might need to include in such a schema. Ideally, you would ask yourself each question and write down your answer. Best practice is to create a file naming schema before you have generated or collected any data. First, what group of files will this naming convention cover? You can use different conventions for different file sets, or use similar conventions for similar groups of files, if it makes sense to do so. Next, we start to consider what's in these files to help us describe them. What information is important about these files and makes each file distinct? Ideally, you're picking about 3 pieces of metadata here, and never any more than 5. The next question still has us thinking about that metadata. Namely, if we need to abbreviate or encode metadata that is described by lots of text. If there are regular categories, it's a good idea to standardize the categories or replace them with 2 or 3 letter codes. Make sure you document this. Once we've thought about what metadata needs to be included in the file name, we then pivot to the order. It might seem trivial, but this really helps with sorting and searching. So think about how you want to sort and search for your files to decide what metadata should appear at the beginning of the file name. Sometimes it won't matter, but you do want a consistent order even in these cases. Our next question is a literal small thing, but one that can have a big impact. You should decide what characters you will use to separate each piece of metadata in the file name. Many computer systems can't handle spaces in file names, and programs may already carry meaning for special characters like periods. So I always recommend using underscores for the benefit of humans and machines. In fact, best practice is to use only numbers, letters, or underscores in the file name. Finally, consider if you will need to track different versions of each file. The easiest way to do this is by adding version information to the end of the file name. You can use version numbers, dates, or even different categories. Once you've gone through all the questions, which all address a portion of the schema you'll be creating, you bring all of your answers together in your final schema. During this process, keep in mind these other best practices. Be consistent in the application of your naming schema. This is especially important to remember when multiple people are expected to apply a particular naming schema, such as in collaborations. You also want to make sure you're deploying leading zeros appropriately anytime you're using sequential numbering. Instead of starting off with just 1, 2, 3, you'll want to add on the appropriate number of zeros to make sure the files sort well and have consistent name lengths. This image probably does a better job of showing how that happens than me trying to describe it to you. Finally, try to limit your names to 32 characters or less. That makes it easier to type if you're programming, and also makes it easier to scan for humans. The next step in the process is tackling file folder organization. Your first step is to organize folders into meaningful categories. These are just a few example templates here, where we have different ways of breaking files up, such as by project site, file type, or project. Then, just like we created a file naming convention for individual files, you'll want to do the same for your folder organization. Follow the same guidelines and best practices we discussed in the file naming section, such as determining unique elements and considering order and abbreviations. It can also be useful, if you find a system that works really well for you or for a type of project, to create a blank template that you or others can use in the future. Now, let's look at some other best practices to think about while creating this organizational structure. First, you want to avoid overlapping categories. A common place you see this is multiple folders called data. This can get confusing rather quickly. There's always the extra step of specifying which data folder you mean, and it's easy to save things in the wrong place. Next, in general, we want to avoid folders that are too large. Of course, this won't hold for certain exceptions, such as including all of one data type in a folder. But in most cases, you want folders to be manageable for a human to look through. At the same time, we don't want our folder structures to get too deep. Think about how many clicks it takes to get there, or how long a file path may be. These best practices are helpful for you as a human looking at the folders, but they can also make it much easier to navigate and work through the files programmatically as well. It's a balance between not going too large or too deep, and what makes sense for one project or researcher may not for someone else. Part of using a directory structure and file naming convention is documenting what everything means. Someone unfamiliar with your project should be able to look at your documentation and computer files and understand in detail what you did and why. One straightforward way to keep track of both these things is a README for your organization system. You can include all the content we've covered here and store it at the base of your directory so it's easy for others to find. We have a companion video about best practices for README files that you can check out if you want more information. That brings us to the end of this video. If you have any questions, you can always get support by emailing help@msdlive.org with your questions or suggestions.